Well, hello. Welcome to the Creative Writing Life podcast, where we talk with writers from all mediums and genres about themselves, their work, and advice they have for writers. I'm your host, Paul Zeidman, and my guest today is Janice Deal, and we're going to be talking to her about her book, The Blue Door, a novel. Janice, welcome to the Creative Writing Life podcast.
Paul, thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it is my pleasure. And before we get into a little bit about Janice, as readers, I do this every single time. As viewers and listeners of the show, unless you're reading a transcription, that works too. As viewers and listeners are familiar, we'd like to start things off talking about things we may have read or watched lately. Did we like them? Did we not like them? We're kind of like, don't need to see that one again. I'm going to go first just to give Janice a little time to gather her thoughts. Recently, I took a long flight to somewhere, and so I had a lot of time on my hands. So going there, I got to watch My Old Ass, which I really liked. That was very well done. I got to watch A Real Pain, which I knew was nominated for Best Original Screenplay. That was really good as well. And of course, I had to watch Venom: The Last Dance because that's the kind of guy I am. Fell asleep for a half an hour in the middle of it. Didn't make a difference. I knew exactly what was going on, and it probably helped make the movie that much shorter. That was going there. So coming back, what did I watch? I'm gonna have to throw it to Janice because I'm suddenly blanking on what I watched, but I'll let her take it over for right now.
Oh my gosh, Paul. Well, just a couple comments. We've also seen My Old Ass and A Real Pain. Love those movies.
Mm.
And I just want to say, A Real Pain was a pain for us to see because David and I tried to go see it. We bought tickets. We got to the theater and we found out at the 11th hour, AMC had done a bait and switch and they pulled A Real Pain. They hadn't sold enough tickets and they were showing Wicked. So David and I did not see Wicked, and we went home and we ended up streaming A Real Pain. But I love
Wow.
Culkin. Yeah.
That's really strange because back when I was in my late teen years, I worked at a movie theater, and if we only had one ticket sold, we still showed the movie. So
Oh,
it doesn't make
oh
sense unless
yeah.
that's an AMC thing.
This is the first time it's ever happened to us, and it was a huge surprise, but we liked it on streaming too. But the most recent movie we did successfully see at a theater. We went to go see Steven Soderbergh's latest film, Black Bag. I don't know
Hmm.
if you've read about it. Um, Fun, witty espionage thriller set in the British Secret Service. Um, I'm a huge Soderbergh fan, and his last couple movies were just kind of okay, but I loved Black Bag. In fact, I don't know if you do Letterbox. I don't, but if I did, 4 out of 5 stars.
Wow.
So that's my statement.
Okay. Well, I will say, I've heard a lot of good things about it. So that and Mickey 17 are the ones that I'm intrigued to see now because Mickey 17 is actually playing at my neighborhood theater. And
Oh
so,
man, Run, Don't Walk. I love that movie. Oh my God, I love that movie so much. Well, I really like that director, and I
uh-huh.
know everyone's all like, "Oh, it's not like Parasite," but that's what I love about his work. I don't know, did you ever see Train to Busan?
I love Train to Busan. Well, that's the thing is I wouldn't go in expecting it to be like Parasite because I don't want it to be like the same movie because I want it, if he's telling a new movie, then I assume it's going to be a new story with new characters and new concepts. So I guess people just think, well, this is the kind of stuff he does, and that's not what this is.
Yeah,
So
exactly. I think you'll be delighted. Robert Pattinson, he's come a long way since, wasn't he in Twilight?
Twilight, he
Yeah.
he was the one of the he was the vampire guy in Twilight.
Yeah.
That's all I know.
He's not sparkly at all in Mickey 17. So
Just his personality. And the thing is,
exactly.
it's driving me crazy that I can't remember some of the movies I watched on the flight home, but I know that at the end I only had so much time to work with. So I went with an old reliable and I started watching Galaxy Quest and still
Oh,
holds up. I still love it. Of course, I'm biased because I love that kind of material and it's just so funny and a lot of the jokes still land. So I probably had like 30 to 40 minutes left until we landed. So, and it's not streaming anywhere. So, it's a bit of a dilemma. Do I try to rent it? Do I buy it from Amazon or rent it from Amazon? So, we'll see. Try not to give Bezos money, but that's another issue. But I've got books there. So, what a moral dilemma that is. Anyway, so we're here to talk today to Janice Deal about herself and her new book, The Blue Door, a novel. So this is the bio off of Janice's website. Janice Deal is the author of two novels, The Blue Door and The Sound of Rabbits, and two story collections, Strange Attractors, The Ephraim Stories, and The Decline of Pigeons. The recipient of an Illinois Arts Council Artist Fellowship Award for prose, Janice has won the Moth Short Story Prize and, I'm going to mess this up, the Kajibi
Yeah.
Kajibi Macron Prize. Her books have also been finalists for the Chicago Writers Association Book of the Year, the Flannery O'Connor Award, the Black Lawrence Press Big Moose Prize, I love that name, and the Many Voices Project annual competition. She lives with her husband in the Chicago area. And before we started, we were talking about Chicago stuff, but we're not going to get into that. Janice, okay, so let's talk a little bit about Janice, the person. So, how did you get your start as a writer? Were you a writer as a kid? Were you a voracious reader? Was this kind of something that you came into later in life? How did you become Janice the writer?
It's well, you touched on two of them right there, Paul. I've always been a huge reader as a kid. It's that classic tree grows in Brooklyn thing. You go to the library, you come out with a big stack of books. Um, but writing I came to later. I It's kind of funny. I had taken a fiction writing class as an undergrad, and I was, getting, fine grades, but I didn't feel that spark. And I kind of felt like at 18, 19, whatever, that I really didn't have much to say. So I literally dropped out of the class. I was like, not for me. Fast forward 10 years, and I'm working at a magazine, Where Chicago Magazine. And just as part of that trajectory, I took a journalism class through Northwestern. And I realized, wow, it's kind of fun to be back in school. And so when that class wrapped up, on a weird lark, I took a fiction writing class. And apparently, life had happened in that interstitial 10 years because I started taking the class and I really liked it. And I think it helped that the instructor, a guy named Fred Schaefer, he's one of my writing mentors. When the class wrapped up, he invited me to be participate in a writing workshop he runs out of his home. And oh my gosh, Paul, after that, never looked back. I've been writing ever since.
What was involved with the writing workshop? I mean, what does it they just say, okay, write whatever you want, or were there themes or prompts?
Oh my gosh, Paul, it's a great workshop that continues to this day. And honestly, Paul, I don't know how Fred does this, but every year the class runs roughly from, September through May. And every year Fred settles on an author. While I was participating in the workshop, authors ranged from Charles Baxter to Elizabeth Strout, um, and we'll study their work all year long. And he does a novel workshop too, so he always chooses an author that writes both forms. You study the author's work extensively throughout the year, and at the end, like in May, Fred does an interview with that individual, and we all participate. And of course, we know their work well. So that's a piece of it. And how Fred operates is the things we're learning from, the author, from, say, Elizabeth Strout, we're applying to our own work. And so I was in the short story workshop for many years. You'd work on your own stories. And every year, like the first half of the class would be devoted to talking about Elizabeth Strout or Charles Baxter. And then the second half, we'd discuss people's manuscripts, kind of in a workshop format. And we'd have read, it would be maybe three manuscripts a week. We'd have read them the week before. We'd offer feedback to our peers, and then when it was our turn, your story would come up two, three times during that year. You'd get feedback and you'd be pushing your story along. So I cannot stress enough what a profound experience this was. It's like this three-pronged approach where you're learning from a published author, you're learning from your peers, and you're learning from Fred, who is um, kind of a magical editor. He has that ability to see what you're trying to do and help you tease it out.
Okay, I want to clarify one thing. So you said that he would bring in the author, so you would study the works of this of a writer, and then Fred would bring in that writer what at the end of the whole thing just to like for a Q and A or
Exactly. And it's this, and the format has changed since COVID. When I was participating in the workshop, it was an in-person thing. So
sure.
you go to like a theater space, and there would be Tobias Wolff and Fred on the stage chatting, and we could ask questions. And, we were, because we just immersed ourselves in the author's work for the past 9 months, you
Hmm.
know, we had some, thoughtful questions to ask. After COVID, during that time, the class went online, it went on Zoom, and the interviews went on Zoom too. And one thing Fred realized is that we've been able to work with authors who maybe are from Ireland or from England.
Oh, sure.
Zoom calls still work.
Yeah.
And so, like for instance, this year, and I'm not officially in the workshop anymore, but it's really cool. He's a friend and a mentor, and so I do read the author throughout the year, and I participate in the interview. So this year it's Lauren Groff, and her short stories just blow the doors off the barn. She's awesome.
That is fantastic, and I have to say that when you're in the audience and you're asking someone whose work you really admire, you ask them a question. One of the most uplifting sensation is for them to say, "That's a really good question."
Oh my gosh, get out of my head. It's so true because, I don't know if you've ever had that experience where, you go see an author at a reading, and I still remember she was so kind, but this was years ago. I had just started writing. I went to go see Joyce Carol Oates.
Hmm.
At the end, you can go up and meet the author and they sign your book. And it was like that, I think it's Chris Farley character. I
You know in
really liked
that
your
chapter
work.
where the guy does that thing? That was cool.
Remember when you wrote Blonde? Yeah, it was just so ridiculous. And she was really gracious. That's my statement about Joyce Carol Oates. Very gracious human.
That is fantastic. Okay, so what was the path that led you to work on The Blue Door, a novel by Janice Deal? I mean, so what like give well, let's start things off. Like give us the elevator pitch for it. The 5, 10 second pitch for it.
Oh, sure. Blue Door. It's about a woman named Flo. She's wrestling with some very human issues. I'd say loss, redemption, identity, and she's doing so in the context of a single day. The book takes place over a day's time, and the factors that are kind of driving this narrative are there's again three things that have happened. Right before the book opens, her best friend, a pastor named Sunby, has died of cancer. The morning the book opens, she gets a letter from, or a card from her daughter, Teddy. And Teddy is a young adult now, but when she was a teen, she committed a horrific crime, went to juvenile detention, is out now, and she's reached out to her mom and said, I'm going to come for a visit. And Flo is wrestling with some things. She's still 10 years after the fact trying to make sense of what Teddy did, trying to figure out what her role as a mom was and what happened, and just trying to anticipate what her relationship with her daughter will look like now. So, all this stuff, this cocktail of emotions is brewing. And then the third thing happens, and Flo loves animals. She's got this menagerie at home. She has a dog. The dog gets out. She goes to find him. And so she's grappling with all this stuff while she's walking through the desert looking for dog.
Yeah, I want to get into that, the whole the events of the story, but all of the emotions behind it. I want to get to that in just a minute. So, what was the inspiration for this story? Was it just a bolt from the blue, or was it something that had been kind of simmering for a while, and you just were kind of like slowly putting the pieces together?
Um, it was the latter.
Hmm.
Several years ago, I think around 2019, I had gone with a friend to an off-campus writers workshop class. and the theme was braided storylines. So the whole idea of a book that comprises two stories that inform each other, and they're kind of different. Like, I think that the instructor gave the example of, oh, you have a contemporary story and then you have recipes, and what's the conversation between the two of them? And Paul, I was so intrigued by that, but I didn't really have any place to put that. So I just put it in my brain pan because at that time I was working on a series of linked short stories that eventually became the collection Strange Attractors that was published by New Door Books in 2023. And so anyway, cool class, filed it away. A couple years pass. I'm getting a lot of traction on these linked stories. And in two of them, there are the characters of Flo and Teddy. And those two stories actually deal with Teddy's crime, where she actually kills her teacher, and then the immediate aftermath. And I'd say in 2021, so a couple years after I learned about braided narratives, um, Teddy and Flo, I had written those stories and they kind of stuck with me. I kept on thinking about them and I found myself wondering, gosh, I wonder where Flo is now.
Hmm.
And it came to me that a braided storyline might be a great way to explore where she's at. And as you know, and listeners may want to know, the two storylines are Flo's current day situation. She's living in the desert. She's moved all over the place, landed in the desert. And the second storyline is a fairy tale that I wrote for her. I kind of gave to her as something she would have grown up on, that her own mom would have told her. And I was interested in how um, those two storylines played off of each other and kind of talked to each other.
Okay, yeah, that does kind of address a couple of questions that I had. The first one, because you mentioned that Flo and Teddy were both from your previous work, Strange Attractors. So, I mean, was it one of the characters or just kind of their whole situation that was the spark for that? There's more to this story, or let's check in and see where they are 10 years later. Was it just an overall like fascination with what was going on with them, or just kind of like I don't know. It just kind of it like just the the impact that they had on your writer's brain was just kind of like so strong and so influential that it just stuck with you and just you couldn't shake it no matter what you tried.
You know what? I almost think it's a combination of everything you just said. Sometimes I think with the characters we write, um, it's like personal chemistry in real life.
Hmm.
Like, I don't really know, why did Flo leap out and not Rex or one of the other characters in the stories?
Hmm.
It was Flo, and maybe it was because, in part, the two stories, there's Teddy's crime, and then there's the immediate aftermath. And so I guess, in real life, trauma doesn't always manifest immediately. Sometimes after something really hideous happens, um, a person is numb. And she's kind of numb. Flo is kind of numb
Yeah.
in the immediate aftermath of what's happened. She's kind of putting one foot in front of the other. She's going through the motions. And I was like, very interested in where she'd be farther on when she's had some time to process what's happened. And I was really, spoiler alert, but at the end of the second story in Strange Attractors, she ends up moving down to the Southern Illinois town where Teddy is in juvenile detention. And that's where we leave her. And I just I just really wanted to know, well, where did she end up? Did she and Teddy end up together? Um, so yeah, so that's how that all came
So
about.
why do you think it took a while to develop the story of what happened after that? I mean, because you said that that's how that one story end or how that one story ended. So what stopped you from just like I'm just putting everything else to the side. I'm gonna see this story through to the end.
It's Paul, great question. I think it was partly because I wasn't done with the Strange Attractors stories yet,
Mm.
and they just kept on springing up like mushrooms. And I will say, I also work at a glacial pace. So, I mean, witness the fact it took me 2 years to even dive into the braided storyline. But in the meantime, I was kind of, working away at the Strange Attractors stories. And when I kind of had a little break in there, um, I thought, okay, let's revisit flow. So
Okay, it sounds like it's one of those stories that it simmered inside you, and it just that you had this is a story you had to tell, you had to write it. It just took
yeah.
a while for it to actually go from up here out onto the page.
Yes, yeah. I don't know what that delayed reaction is all about, but yeah,
Okay, so before we get to the fairy tale aspect, one of the things I thought was really amazing is that now the story of what happens during the story is very simple. As you said, Flo goes out to look for the dog, but there's so many emotional complexities along the way that it's almost like a stream of consciousness that she's like going talking thinking about this one thing, but that suddenly she's talking about this other one. So as you're developing the story, now, was that your intent, or was it kind of like, okay, this is what I want to happen, but I need to flesh this out a little bit? She's going to look for the dog, but what is she going to think about? Because you can't just, it's a short story. It's a really short story. Flo goes out to look for the dog, and man meets this lady with her bratty kid, and then meets this guy with this grouchy neighbor, and that's it.
yeah. End of story.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
well, it's interesting because uh, I think, well, the way I approached it was I knew I wanted to do this braided storyline, so I wrote the fairy tale separately.
Hmm.
But I already had in mind some of the things I knew Flo would be wrestling with, but I hadn't fully discovered them yet. So for a while, I just immersed myself in fairy tales, and I did find, I mean, we can talk more about that, but I did find there's some striking patterns that come up
Hmm.
again and again in fairy tales. So I had the fairy tale, and then I was like, okay, I have to start working on Flo's story. And at first, really, the problem that I had to address was early on, it was all in Flo's head. I
Hmm.
mean, Paul, I had to give her something to do.
Yeah, yeah.
She couldn't just sit there in her apartment and muse about, wow, in the Wayback Machine. And so I kind of fleshed out, and I will say, I've written short stories, I've written novels. Probably short stories are my great love.
Hmm.
And the way novels are sometimes accessible to me is I write them in chunks.
Hmm.
And so, I had kind of started fleshing out some of the things that Flo's grappling with, her own identity. What does this mean for who she is? Loss, all of the above. And then I had to give her something to do.
Hmm.
So, I think it was Charles Baxter who said, you want your character to have problems, and so you don't put them in a room with nice people. You give them something they have to deal with. So I had Dog run away, and that's a little bit complicated too because Flo is never. She's kind of taken Dog in, and she loves him. She does right by him, but she's never felt quite as close to him, so she thinks, as she does to some of the other animals. And she goes out searching for him, and her feelings about Dog are kind of a parallel to what's going on as she's trying to sort human relationships. So I started identifying interactions she could have
Hmm.
that could either challenge her or uplift her, remind her of her strengths, or kind of force her to deal with some of her weaknesses or her fears. And I might be going off track here.
Oh
Am
no,
I
no, it's perfectly
question?
fine because
Yeah.
what you're talking about, because my oeuvre is primarily screenwriting, and
Yeah.
so in screenwriting, conflict is key. that,
Oh,
and
yeah.
nobody wants a story of, the nice, happy people, as you said, she can't go into a room where everybody's friendly, that she has to have conflict, that it doesn't have to be earth-shattering, but, the dog runs away and nobody wants to help her, and she's trying to find her way through, and like, where could the dog be? And it's always that ongoing conflict, which helps it helps develop the character. But one of the things that you also mentioned, that what I thought was fascinating about the whole book, there's two things. So the first one was that because I didn't read the two things from Strange Tractors, so this is all new territory for me.
Yeah.
So that as Flo is out looking for the dog, and we're kind of like, getting insight into her thinking process in her brain, that there's the reveal, the exposition, the backstory. Uh, and was your intention to present it that way? Because you can't always just have somebody talking to themselves, which it's kind of gets a little monotonous. But like I said before about the whole stream of consciousness thing that she thinks about, this is what happened with Teddy with the teacher, and this is what happened when she was in Juvie Land, and this is about all the places she moved, and it bounces around a lot, but it doesn't feel disorganized. It just
Good.
feels it's all these pieces of this grand picture are slowly put into place, and it's I guess you're letting the reader put it all together, and like you never come out and specifically give details about certain parts of the backstory. You kind of like almost leave it to our imaginations
Mhm.
to try to figure it out. I thought that was really great. And so, because I guess this kind of ties back to your mention about the braided storylines. So developing all of these different things, but you already had the past, what happened before to work with. So did you like start with that, and then you thought, okay, and you said, she has to have something to do, so she goes to look for the dog, but also like about the note from Teddy or the letter. Was that like from the outset, or were you? Was the story really formed when you began, or was it a very gradual, okay, I'm going to try this. Oh, this doesn't work. Throw that in the wastebasket. I'm going to try this. Or there a lot of starting over? Like, what was the process for putting not just, I guess, the main story together, but for me, I call them just subplots. So all of these things to tie them together.
It's that is a great question. I think that if I had to think about the process, it was almost like an accrual, a building. The fairy tale came easily, but figuring out Flo's journey and how I was gonna, get her outside of her head. And I will say, my first effort, I was kind of slowly building and getting Flo out the door and having her run into some people. And this is where New Door Books, the publisher, oh my gosh, Paul, they really helped me elevate this book to the next level because they liked it. They liked what I ultimately sent them, but it wasn't quite there. And I worked with their editor, Nathaniel Popkin, and it's great to have an editor who gets you, who gets your work. And he asked really good questions. And he also pushed hard. There were some encounters, like the encounter in the playground was really not that fleshed out. And
Mhm.
he challenged me. He asked me some really good questions. What does this encounter mean? And I had the whole thing, for listeners who haven't read the book, she runs into a mom and the mom's young son, and things go badly. And they kind of really, it's like, in the movies where if you have a wound and you're being interrogated and someone like digs in the wound, that's what was going on. Flo feels very uncertain about who she is, about how good she is as a mother, given
Mm.
what Teddy did. And she's invited to, help out, and things go awry, as you know. And so that piece, that came late, and that was
Hmm.
thanks to Nathaniel and the questions he asked me.
Okay, that's a great point. The other thing I wanted to ask you is that so much of the story revolves around Flo and her relationship with Teddy. And starts with she gets the letter, and then she thinks as she's out looking for the dog, all of these thoughts about going over her past, basically, kind of reviewing everything that's happened and her how she views it. The one thing I thought was amazing is that Teddy is such a huge part of the story, but isn't there. And I hope that's not a spoiler.
Oh
Uh,
my God. No, it's not. And I'm so glad that was interesting to you, Paul, because that was interesting to me too. And I think that I knew, I'm trying to think back, but I think I knew pretty early on Teddy was never going to come on screen, as it were.
mhm.
Because Flo hasn't seen her for a while, and what Flo holds within her are her memories of Teddy and the letters she gets from her. And she has no idea what to expect. And spoiler alert, but Flo is the one who's in a different place at the end and is more ready to receive whatever's going to happen.
Well, I think because it is primarily it's Flo's story that it's just she happens to be a part of this bigger story, but we never get Teddy's side of it because it all of the focus is on Flo, while she's going through these things that are directly involving her, the dog and all the people she runs into. But again, we get the insight into her stream of conscious, all the things that she's thinking and how she's feeling. And I guess, I guess the inevitable follow-up question is, book two is, from Teddy's perspective, I guess.
Oh my gosh, we'll see. Yeah.
So I'll come back in 5 years when the other side of the blue door is when it's once
Yeah.
again. Well,
Yeah.
I did want to go back to the fairy tale aspect of the story. So that was I thought it was really clever, and I love the fact that you tie it in that it's something that Flo's mom told her when she was a child. So, and you said so. I'm guessing you made it up out of whole cloth, just kind of like. And were you looking for? Uh, Plans and for in screenwriting it's setups and payoffs like set up like something that happens in the fairy tale can still apply to the real world with flow is or was that something you had from the outset or was it just kind of like oh hey this could happen in the fairy tale and drastically change something around.
Oh, yeah. And the two, even while I was working on them, the two informed each other. So, like, there's, that creature that Ksenia runs into. And I had already written in the main story that Flo has eczema. And so I kind of gave the creature sort of eczema. He has those weird scales. But in terms of the fairy tale, I think what was so interesting to me is once I determined that's what I was going to do, I just went crazy and I read a whole bunch of fairy tales from all over the world. And it was so interesting to me how there are these common elements. Like the number three appears again and again and again. Maybe, and I do think this is true. I think, when oral storytelling was a thing, if you had a character who did three things, that's something people could remember. Like the
Mhm.
character is not going to do eight things because then people forget. So the number three, and then just the themes of um, redemption, sometimes transformation, big deal in fairy tales. And then I started getting really interested, Paul, because the character of Flo, her best friend who's passed away, he was a pastor, and they had such. I was so interested in their friendship because Sunbee's a pastor, Flo's agnostic, but they really connect. And I think I started to recognize how fairy tales and at least some aspects of organized religion, I mean, they both have throughout history been ways that people try to make sense of the world. And
Mhm.
there's also like those weird parallels, like the idea of transfiguration or the number three, like in Christianity and fairy tales. And so I just went nuts. I was like, oh, this is so cool. So I tried to, some of the things, I did a rough draft of the fairy tale, but then you kind of start layering in things that make the conversation between the storylines a little bit richer. And sometimes it's super surface level, like, oh, I'm going to give the creature scales because Flo has eczema. And other times it's a little bit deeper. So that was just a lot of fun. And I do want to say too, I was interested in the fact that, contemporary fairy tales, you go see, say, Cinderella, happy ending. fairy tales, especially like the Grimm fairy tales, not always happy,
Yeah.
sometimes very dark. And that was interesting to me too. And it kind of informed some of the things that happen throughout the book, especially when she meets that scary dude at the end.
Yeah, yeah, very much so. One of the things I also want to ask you is that you know they say write what you know. So how much of the story and the characters are familiar to you? I mean, you already had Teddy and Flo in previous work, but was there something you just kind of you wanted to say, or was there just again was there something so fascinating about these two characters and their relationship and their world that you just felt compelled to to tell it?
Yeah, I think that if I look through work I've written over the years, I don't know, I think it was like Richard Bausch, he said once, you write what matters to the bone, and it keeps on cropping up, whether you are conscious of it or not. And I think that an aspect of the human condition that's so interesting to me is the idea of loss. We live long enough, we're all going to experience loss in one
Hmm.
form or another. And this is a book, in part about loss and reinvention. And when somebody, sometimes when something happens, we're invited to figure out what's our next chapter. And so I'm not sure that it's very specific to me, but maybe I don't know if it's possible to say it's an aspect of humanity. Like another example, Jimmy Carter just died, and so much the theme that kept on coming up again and again in his obituaries was how, you know, he had this presidency. It ended on a kind of disappointing note, and even though he had done some really good things, but he was invited to create a second chapter.
Hmm.
And I don't know that I was thinking about Jimmy Carter when I was writing this book, but I just think that exemplifies if we live long enough, these themes are going to be part of our lives in one way or another. Loss, reinvention, figuring out who we are. We're
Hmm.
always the same person, but hopefully we continue to grow and become more enlightened.
Yeah, sure, sure. So I think I guess the follow-up question about characters, are any of the characters in the story based on people that you actually know or at least influenced, like the grouchy guy down the street with the dog or the lady at the playground? I mean, because a lot of because with screenwriting they say that every character, no matter how minor a role they play in the story, is some aspect or some facet of the writer's personality. Like that.
Oh,
That's
wow.
that's how I would act in the store. That's how I would act in the store. That's how I would treat the guy at the gas station, that sort of thing. So, I mean, was there maybe like a subconscious influence on your part on some of these characters, or just thought I'm going to write a really grouchy neighbor?
Well, I think, okay, first of all, that's fascinating and maybe a little scary that all characters have a piece of ourselves in there. But I will say, I think that, again, if we live long enough, whether it's an experience we've had or read about or even heard, riding on the bus, a conversation, um, all those things inform our experiences, end up in our writing either literally or in a more I don't even know what the word is, like this didn't happen to me, but I know this is part of the human experience because of what I've read. And I think about uh, one time David and I, we were in Paris, we were on a sabbatical, and we were there to write. And but we both were smart enough to know, you know, we're in Paris. We've got to get out there and experience life. And did those experiences end up in some form, conscious or unconscious, in my stories or my novels? 100%. But it's just that I think living in the world and paying attention, observing. I just read this biography about Nelson Algren by Mary Wisniewski. It's a great book. And Algren was interesting. He was sometimes super quiet and he would, he'd go to a party, he could be the life of the party. He could be very charming. Um, but he was always observing and he was very, very interested in what made people tick. And I think that I can say that, gosh, I don't want to generalize, but I feel like every writer ever, whether they're drawing on their personal experiences or just what they're learning year by year about what it means to be human, all that stuff ends up in the soup, you know?
Oh yeah. As a writer I keep tons of notes about a story that I'm working on at the time. But
Yeah.
every writer will be suddenly be inspired by a new idea and then they'll hit pause, write that down. Some writers will keep going on the new one. I'm one of those. I will write it down, store it in my Google Docs folder, and go back to the one I was working on because that way, when I'm done with this one or I want to take a break, I can go to that other thing and work on that. And therefore, that helps me not get burned out on what I'm working on, but also it kind of helps keep the creative engine going.
Oh my gosh. Yes, I've got to say, man, we're living parallel lives because that's my approach too. I have a Google Doc and like I I have the worst handwriting of all times. And so I type everything. I'll send myself an email on my phone and I'll be like, oh my God, I just heard this, at the mall or whatever. And then I put it in my file and then my heart can rest and I go back to work on whatever I'm working on. Because otherwise we'll forget. We think we won't
Oh,
forget, but we'll forget.
and then what's a pleasant surprise is you'll go back, say like 3 or 6 months later, dig up that thing you wrote, and it's like, wow, that's actually pretty good.
Oh my God. And I love it when that happens because then there's the other thing where you go back and it's
What
like,
the hell was I
what did I
thinking?
think? Yeah.
Exactly. Okay, so once again, Janice Deal, the Blue Door, a novel. So Janice, what is next? I mean, we talked, potential sequels to the story, but you're probably one of those writers. You've got a lot of irons on this, or a lot of pots on the stove, so to speak.
Thank you for asking. Yeah, I'm currently working on a new series of short stories, and Paul, they're real knee slappers. They're all about death, metaphorical or literal. So I've been working on those and starting to send some of them out. One of them is actually going to be in the Colorado Review this summer. So huzzah! Um,
Great,
so
congratulations.
that's what that's what I'm working on right now.
Okay, and so what if people want to find out more about you and they want to get a copy of this book, The Blue Door, or some of your other works? I know you have a website, but you can give that address. And if you have any social media ats that you can throw out.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you. My website is janicesteal.com. And I'm Janice M. Deal on Instagram, Facebook, and Blue Sky. So,
Okay, Instagram, Facebook, and Blue Sky. Okay, fantastic. Janice M. Deal. Okay, so one more time, just to wrap things up. The Blue Door by Janice Deal. Janice, this has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time today.
oh my gosh, thank you so much, man. This has been a lot of fun.
Wonderful, wonderful. All right. Viewers and listeners, if you enjoyed today's show, please hit like. Feel free to leave a comment and subscribe. Especially the positive ones. I love those. Social media, you can check out my screenwriting blog at maximumz.blog. Still on Twitter. I don't know if I'm going to keep it or not. I keep going back and forth. At maximum_Z. And this show is on Twitter as well at podcast CWL. I'm on Blue Sky and Instagram at Pez Screenwriting, PEZ. And the show is also podcast CWL on Blue Sky. Yeah, we talked about Amazon before. Yes, I still have books on there. My Go Ahead and Ask books, the ones about screenwriting and pie. Like I said, that's Janice. I'm Paul. This has been the Creative Writing Life podcast. Thanks for listening. Stay safe, stay healthy, and most importantly, go write something.